Two murder investigations from the case files of Lieutenant Joe Kenda. First, police square off
Hands in the air
against a homicidal madman.
We'll take you SWAT out.
You have to take someone at their word when they make threats.
This was a very volatile situation.
And the prospect of bloodshed grows by the minute.
So now we're in a total standoff.
Sergeant Kemp, Sergeant Velez.
If he starts shooting at us, we're going to return fire.
I'll take the shot, nobody else.
Anticipation is the biggest feeling that I can remember having.
Put your hands in the air, Larry. Do it now.
Then, violence erupts on the floor of a local factory.
Blow it.
There's blood just everywhere.
Why would that happen? We need to find that out. In the state of Colorado, to commit a crime, you must engage in willful and knowing conduct. Willful and knowing are just two words. As is always the case, the devil is often in the details.
It's an ordinary Thursday evening, and Clark Coopens is driving home to the trailer park. Well, when Clark pulls up to his trailer, he hears his neighbor raving mad, and he wonders what's going on. So he rushes inside to his wife.
What the hell is going on with Larry?
He's been over there for over an hour, just acting like a madman. I don't know what's going on.
Oh, no. This is not good.
He sees Larry there with two guns in his hands.
Should we do something?
Not 4 miles away, Sergeant Joe Kenda is wrapping up his shift with some paperwork.
All right, you got the report for me?
Yes, sir. Here you go.
All right, thank you. Have a good night.
I was a patrol sergeant in March of 1984. On this particular evening, I was in police headquarters reviewing my officers' reports.
Hey, Sarge. Got a woman out front. You probably need to come talk to her.
All right, just give me a few minutes.
She's pretty worked up.
Well, okay then.
So I immediately went out to the front lobby.
Excuse me, ma'am. Can I ask what's wrong?
And I meet this woman. She says her name is Pam Olson, and she's very agitated.
It's my husband, Larry. He's threatening to kill himself.
She says that she no longer lives with her husband and that he called her to tell her that he had 2 loaded handguns and he intended to kill himself and he would kill anyone, particularly the police, who attempt to intervene.
This isn't the first time this happened. But now, I really think he's going to do it.
And where is he now?
At his trailer on North Cascade.
Is he alone?
Point.
As far as I know, he's alone. I mean, it's just really just him and the cat.
Do you mind stepping back here? We can talk in private.
We need to continue to talk to her to learn more about Larry's personality. Why does he get so agitated? What are his...
Officers rush to the trailer park in hopes of defusing the situation.
One of the officers was walking up to the trailer when Mr. Olson came out and confronted him.
What the hell do you think you're doing?
In his right hand is a long-barreled .44 Magnum revolver. In his left hand is a .350 rifle. They are made for one purpose, to kill another human being.
Hands in the air.
Larry, put the guns down.
I ain't putting that until someone takes care of me.
All right, well, let us help.
You get me SWAT. I'm gonna tell you SWAT. I'll be right here waiting for him.
And that's a really unusual request. What is he up to?
We're going to need TEU out here.
TEU stands for the Tactical Enforcement Unit. It is the Colorado Springs Police Department SWAT team.
Back at headquarters, Kenda continues to speak with Larry Olson's wife, Pam.
That if we can get to the reason why he's so distressed, that may give us an avenue of pursuit on how to calm him down.
Pam, I need you to tell me everything you can about Larry. His background, relationships, anything.
Pam reports that she's been married to Larry for the past 10 years and they have 2 small children together. The relationship was good for a while, but things eventually began to unravel, especially after he lost his job as a plumber.
Oh, he's been depressed for so long now. And he's an alcoholic. That's one reason I kicked him out of the house.
How long ago was that?
He straightened out for a while, but I knew it wouldn't last.
So do you think he relapsed?
When he called me today, he was slurring his words.
In the opinion of his estranged wife, was drunk, and that's an advantage to us.
Excuse me for a second. I need to pass on some of that information to the officers at Larry's house. Sergeant Kemp to Sergeant Velez.
If he sobers up, he may be more reasonable than he would be when he's intoxicated.
Hostage negotiator Sergeant Louis Velez has arrived on scene and sets up operations inside a trailer next door to Larry Olson's.
Roger that. Thanks, Kenda.
So what's the plan?
I want you guys to stand guard, just in case he comes out and tries to hurt someone.
Okay.
In the meantime, I'm gonna call Larry on the phone, try to get him to talk as long as possible.
It is my job to try to take the individual from that highly emotional state and get him or her to a position of talking rationally. Anticipation is the biggest feeling that I can remember having. I tried about 4 times out there, and I couldn't get a hold of him.
Guess we'll try again in a bit.
Less than 30 minutes later, the tactical enforcement unit arrives.
Come on.
Hey, Lou.
How you doing, Cecil? Thanks for coming.
Yes, sir.
Right this way.
Velez brings TEU Sergeant Cecil Hutchison up to speed.
So what's this guy's name?
Larry Olson.
Larry Olson. Seriously?
Why, you know him?
Hutchison says, we've dealt with this guy twice before when he's done precisely the same thing.
First time about 4 years ago, he had a house over on Zion Street. Lived with his wife and his kids. Same deal. Hey, Larry, can you come outside so we can talk?
Hutchison explains that he'd been firing shots in his house and threatening to kill himself. TEUs was summoned. They surrounded the property.
Hey, Larry, why don't you come on outside and we can talk about it?
I'll come out and talk, but I want to do it on camera. I want to be on the news so everybody can see.
We certainly wanted to avoid, but we did realize we could use this opportunity.
Hey, before we do this, you guys want a beer?
Yeah, actually, we'd love one.
That'd be great.
Police were able to go down the street where they'd cordoned off the media and grab a camera and actually pretend that they were a news crew.
Here you go.
Thanks. Thank you very much.
And that gives police the opportunity to really overcome him.
2 other TEU officers take him down.
This is bull. Let it go. I didn't do anything. Down. Let me go. This is bull. Let go.
He was extremely upset about the rouge that we used, and I believe that he was very hostile towards SWAT because of that previous situation.
So there was a second incident with this guy?
Yeah, second time, more of the same.
Try that again!
Olson has a violent confrontation with his wife and throws her and the children out of the house, and TEU is summoned once again.
This ain't up!
Quit. Yeah, you can say I'm familiar with Larry Olson. He can be really violent, so you better be careful on this one.
Honestly, I don't like the fact that he requested you guys to come down to the scene.
Yeah, me neither. He's never done that before.
You have to take someone at their word when they make threats. He said 16 months ago he was going to get even with SWAT. Well, this evening he has a chance to do precisely that. We're going to have to believe it. The police department is dealing with a 42-year-old man who is barricaded in his house, announcing he's going to kill everybody. TEU is on scene and is trying to make contact with Olson and negotiate his surrender. I am in contact with Pam Olson, the estranged wife of this person, to try to understand the depth of the reason why he's behaving the way he is.
So why do you think Larry wants to kill himself?
Well, he's been in a bad way for some time now.
She said that he was married once before and he lost his first wife and his first child in an automobile accident in Minnesota 14 years ago. And he never really...
Sadness overwhelms him. He even started writing poems to get the feelings out, but it didn't help much. The whole time I've known him, he's really struggled.
Now, you mentioned he had 2 similar incidents with police.
Yeah, but he was never charged for anything.
The judge thought he required mental health counseling and prescription for antidepressants. And she said on both of those occasions, they did help for a while, but only for a while. And now here we are again.
But why today? Can you think of anything that might have pushed him over the edge?
There was something.
She reluctantly said, I filed for divorce a few months ago, and the divorce became final today. Well, that certainly is a very powerful motivator to someone with a history of depression.
I feel terrible.
And this isn't your fault.
With the situation at the trailer park still unstable, TEU moves into position.
You're replacing patrol officers with tactical enforcement unit officers because they are A, well-trained, B, protected by full body armor, and C, very heavily armed.
Although you have a number of high-powered weapons and equipment, and your job really is lives.
But if this generates into a gun battle, they're going to end this, and they're going to do it very quickly.
With the area now secure, TEU officer David Moore hopes to help Sergeant Velez talk some sense into Larry Olson.
This was a very volatile situation.
You want to try calling him again?
Yeah, he asked for SWAT, and we gave him SWAT, so maybe he'll talk now.
So they try the number again, and...
What?
Lo and behold, Olson answers.
Listen, we want to help you, but I need to ask you something first. Are you alone? Is anyone there with you?
Yeah, PJ's here.
PJ? Who's PJ?
That's my cat.
His cat.
So Velez tries to get personal with him. So Larry, what are you doing?
I'm done, man. I got a needle and some potassium chloride here.
Potassium chloride in a number of states is utilized in capital punishment to have an inmate put to death. He could inject himself to kill himself.
Larry, why do you want to hurt yourself?
My life? I lost my first wife and kid, and today, my woman said she don't love me no more. I can't go through that again.
He was slurring his speech a little bit. I wasn't sure whether he had taken alcohol or drugs or both, for that matter.
Larry.
I'm not going back to the loony bin again. Done with all that. Everything, okay?
We'll take you SWAT out! I told you this ain't over!
Now, we were already aware that he'd made threats against TEU, but now he's making a direct threat. He's refusing to maintain contact. We have no ability to reduce his anxiety. So now we're in a total standoff. What's going to happen next is determined by what he does next.
You're not going to trick me this time, PJ.
Over the next hour, things remain eerily quiet.
Are we going to hear a gunshot inside the trailer? For everybody.
I told my guys if this crazy comes back outside again and acts like he's going to do anything, I'll take the shot, nobody else.
Got it.
Hey, Moore,
Sir.
if I miss or he takes me out, I'm gonna need you to take it.
Yes, sir.
And that was the best location that we could find ourselves in, where we could protect the officers who were on containment, should we have to make a decision to actually utilize deadly force.
So we're 3 hours into this situation, agonizing about what's going to happen next. When Olson suddenly comes out the front door of his trailer.
Hands in the air, Larry. Freeze, Larry. Hands in the air. Hands in the air, Larry. Do it now.
He comes down the steps and advances further into the street than he ever has in the past.
Put your hands in the air, Larry. Do it now.
You can see that Olson has a large, long-barreled handgun in his waistband.
Don't do it, Larry.
Hands in the air now.
At that point, he was looking in our direction, and you could see the eye contact with Mr. Olson and Sergeant Hudson. He was reaching for his gun. This was an immediate threat to us.
We're in a gun confrontation here with this individual, and it's time to end it. Larry Olson has been announcing he's going to kill himself and members of the TU team. And now, after hours of this, he stumbles out of his trailer, seeming intent on action.
Don't do this, Larry.
Mr. Olson starts reaching for the .44 that is in the front of his body.
When he does that, he is making a direct threat against Sergeant Hutchison and any other officer he can see.
And that's when a decision was made by the sergeant to
Damn it, one down.
Start a major crime, somebody, Sergeant, please. Got one down, one
I'll mark off the scene.
I'm gonna start CPR. Don't hurry.
When you first responder, quick as possible. It's going down.
Step it up.
At that point, we went immediately to Mr. Olson, and I grabbed one weapon.
You slowed it.
Sergeant Hutchinson grabbed the other.
Yeah, so is this one.
Medical was on call. They were just simply a half a block away. They responded quickly. He was shortly thereafter pronounced deceased.
The first thing that went through my mind was sadness because I wasn't able to get him out safely. This is not the kind of ending that anybody wanted.
The following morning, the district attorney's office begins an investigation, assisted by Detective John Anderson of the CSPD Homicide Unit.
Whenever a police officer shoots a person, in this case kills him, we need to determine if this case was a justifiable homicide. He caused some devastating entry wounds.
I don't smell any alcohol.
There is a great deal of blood of Mr. Olson on his person, and human blood always carries the odor of alcohol with it, so whatever is causing him to stumble isn't alcohol.
Later that afternoon, investigators get their first look inside Larry's trailer.
Larry Olson was armed with 2 handguns. In the residence, we find 2 other firearms. One was a .44 Magnum. The other one was a .22 Magnum Derringer.
This guy wasn't messing around. Potassium chloride.
Also, there's 2 bottles of potassium chloride, a rubber tourniquet, and a syringe.
He said he had that stuff, and he did. He had guns, he had bullets, he had poison chemicals. He didn't use it. He wanted the police to do it for him.
In the bathroom, investigators discover what caused Larry to seem so intoxicated.
We did find a nearly empty bottle of prescription medication of barbiturates. An overdose circumstance would produce the same sorts of behavior as drunkenness.
Also in the residence, we find photographs of his first family as well as his second family and a suicide note.
That note basically was to his wife, and that he did plan on harming himself, and that he couldn't do anything right. It was very short and succinct.
It sounded like Larry was so depressed that he was immobilized, and he couldn't say anything that felt it had any real meaning to him or anybody else. He just wanted to die.
But perhaps it's what investigators find next that provides a deeper motive for Larry's desperate actions.
We found a book that was authored by Larry Olson. Looked like it was more of a self-published book. And what got my attention was about the author, which was inside the flap.
He's talking about how his family died in a car accident in Minnesota.
Kind of strange to put in a little blurb on a book jacket.
I know. I'm gonna look into this.
So the police in Minnesota confirmed to Detective Anderson that the original Mrs. Olson and a small child were killed in an automobile accident. However, Olson was the driver of the car, and he was drunk. He killed his wife and his first child in a DUI single-car accident. So Mr. Olson was not suffering from sadness. He was suffering from guilt.
He was sentenced to 2 years in prison for it, but basically he was in prison for the rest of his life, in his mind and in his heart.
So we can't really say what motivated Larry Olson to do what he did, but we can make an educated guess. That morning, Larry gets notice of the final end of his marriage, and he's popping pills. He's waxing philosophic about his life. He's writing a suicide note saying how he wants it all to end. Then Larry gets this potassium chloride and a syringe, but he doesn't really have the nerve to do it that way. He has his guns and they're loaded and ready to rock, but he really can't do that either. So what's he do next? He calls his ex-wife, says, "I'm going to kill myself," and that causes her to come to the police. So the police arrive, and Larry pops a few more pills and walks outside and reaches for that, and it was.
In this case, it was determined that the death of Larry Olson was a justifiable homicide.
Later that day, Kenda offers his condolences to Larry's family.
I'm very sorry, Pam. You know, our officers found Larry's cat. We'd be happy to put him up for adoption.
No, we'll take him. He's our family pet. He went with Larry when we broke up because he was the one thing that cheered Larry up.
She says, "No, I'm going to take that cat. You know, it's a little part of Larry. I'm going to take it with me, take it home."
Thank you.
PJ!
Yay! There's PJ. He missed you. Yay! He missed you.
Mr. Olson, for whatever twisted reason or series of sin, concluded that he wanted to end his life. I would often say to families who lost a family member through suicide, there is no reason in the unreasonable. You can't explain that, ever.
Coming up, a vicious attack inside a workplace bathroom catapults Kenda.
This case is very murky because of the circumstances of the people involved. This represents an insurmountable challenge.
Alan Brick arrives at work at this little manufacturing company, and he's just getting ready to start into his normal routine.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Alan, something happened in the men's restroom. You have to go. Just go. Hurry.
When all of a sudden, Alan's day took a very different turn. He sees somebody laying on the floor and blood just everywhere.
Rowan, what happened, buddy?
And it's one of his workers.
Buddy, hold on. Let me grab some help. Hold on.
Within the hour, Sergeant Joe Kenda arrives outside Pioneer Industrial Enterprises and meets with Detective David Moore.
Morning, Joe.
In 1988, I was assigned to the Homicide Unit, working under the leadership of Sergeant Joe Kenda.
Hey, Dave. So what do we got?
He explained to me a 29-year-old employee named Rowan Monteith was discovered with severe head trauma and that he is...
We're still gathering information, but it's likely Mr. Monteith was a person with some sort of disability.
And how do we know that?
Well, found out a little information about this factory.
It was what was called a sheltered workshop. They were created to help people with a number of developmental disabilities, both physical and intellectual.
Did anybody see what happened in the bathroom?
Patrol is still looking for witnesses. Right now, we've just got the guy who found the victim.
All right, let's see what he has to say.
Kenda and Moore meet with Alan Brick, a supervisor at Pioneer Industrial Enterprises.
Is Rowan going to be all right? No, we don't know that yet, but he does have some serious injuries.
He's such a nice guy.
Rowan Monteith, as described by everybody who knew him, was very sweet, very easy to get along with. One of the joys of his life was Special Olympics. It was something that he really liked. He was really, really proud of.
Do you know what happened? I'm thinking he had a seizure.
Seizures are not uncommon with people with developmental disabilities, and we also see them particularly in people with Down syndrome.
He probably hit his head on the way down. That's probably why.
The human skull is covered in flesh, but it's very thin, just above the bone, and head wounds tend to bleed profusely. So is that possible? Yes.
The key to learning what really happened to Rowan Monteith lies in the blood evidence.
We heard about all of the blood that was in the bathroom, and then we looked, and it's not there.
Somebody clean this up?
We thought it would be best.
Oh, my. Please don't destroy my evidence.
Take a look at this.
Fortunately, as we look further, we do see some blood spatter where apparently the janitor had missed certain spots of blood.
When humans bleed, the force of gravity drops blood to the floor. So if he hurts his head on a sink, any blood that comes from that wound is going to go straight down.
Looks like it's going up, not down.
It sure does.
That's blunt force trauma bleeding.
The minimal blood evidence doesn't quite jibe with the seizure theory, nor does what Kenda spots next.
Looks like his forehead hit the mirror here. And then he put his left hand out.
Mr. Monteith is perhaps break. Maybe he didn't hit his head. Maybe somebody else did.
I hate to tell you this, Alan, but this wasn't Rowan having a seizure. He must have gotten into a fight.
Rowan? That's hard to believe. He's not the type of guy.
I said, well, it's true. Rowan didn't do this to himself, and the sink didn't do it to him either. We need a human that did it to him.
How'd you discover what happened in here?
It was one of our supervisors, Tony Patterson.
And what did they say happened?
She didn't. She had a class she had to get to.
Can you take us to her?
Yeah, sure.
We meet Tony Patterson. She is a life enrichment teacher at this facility. She's very, very distressed by what she's seen.
It was awful.
Listen, we're gonna need your help on this. Just tell us how you knew something had happened to the bathroom.
All right. Right before class started, one of my students had a nosebleed. So I ran to the women's restroom to get a few tissues.
There's a wall that separates the ladies' room from the men's room. And she hears this noise that doesn't...
She became so concerned that she actually went into the men's room.
She sees a man kicking another man repeatedly in the face. as hard as he can kick, in her words. And he looks at her and then looks down at the victim and continues to kick him in the face. She can't even believe that this is happening, but it's happening.
I didn't know what to do, so I just ran to get help.
Do you know who was kicking Rowan?
I didn't recognize him, no.
What do you look like?
She describes this individual as thin, tall, maybe 6 foot tall, blonde hair, late 20s.
I know he wasn't one of the supervisors here. It's only 9 of us, so we all know each other. But we do have 140 employees in this facility, so it must have been one of them.
You should talk to Jane.
Jane?
She oversees all of us. She pretty much knows everyone here.
Thank you. We believe the attacker is blonde and tall, and he possibly knows Rowan.
We ended up speaking with the supervisor of the facility, Miss Jane Champion. She was extremely helpful.
The description sounds like Michael Zerlinka. He used to be Rowan's roommate that I'm aware of. They were roommates for 2 years and they got along just fine.
Well, that's kind of odd that someone would live with someone for 2 years without an issue and all of a sudden be literally kicking him to death in the bench room. Why would that happen? We need to find that out. We go to this facility. We discover Rowan Monteith has been severely injured in the men's room. It's not an accident. And we believe we know who probably is responsible. Michael Zerlinka.
He's actually a good worker, but like most people here, he has challenges.
She says that Mr. Zerlinka is on the autistic spectrum, and further that he has impulse control issues.
Where will we find Michael?
Chances are he's at his workstation.
Jane Champion offers to take us to where they assemble these plastic parts.
That's Michael, right over there.
Michael clearly matches the description provided by witness Tony Patterson. And that's not all.
His shoes. Check out his shoes.
We realized that his shoes had blood all over them. And bingo, we knew we had our suspect.
You can try, but he does have a great deal of difficulty communicating.
Michael had what was then called central speech disorder, now referred to as ataxia. Ataxia involves difficulty in forming words and being able to speak them clearly.
Hi, Michael. Do you know Rowan? Did something happen today?
He sits back down in his chair and continues to assemble his products. He's decided not to offer his attention. It's a very, very difficult situation.
Okay, what now?
I'm not sure. I mean, the blood gives us probable cause to arrest him, but after that, I don't know.
Mr. Zerlinka represents an insurmountable challenge. There is nowhere to go. He has to be confined because he is dangerous. He's certainly proven that.
Michael, can you come with us?
As police take Michael into custody, they receive word that victim Rowan Monteith has succumbed to his injuries.
And we have psychiatrists examine him and get an expert opinion from them as to whether or not he can understand what the proceedings are against him.
While Michael is sent to the Colorado State Mental Hospital for further evaluation, Kenda and Moore turn to his mother, Barbara Zerlinka, for more insight on Michael's behavior.
I feel horrible about what happened to Rowan. Michael liked Rowan. They got along. Because of my son's condition, he's always had a problem with aggression.
Michael's problems with impulse control resulted him being unable to tolerate very little displeasure. When displeased, he would often display it in a violent manner.
When he was younger, he was on medication that helped him. Then the doctors decided the medication wasn't such a good idea.
Over the years, they believed the long-term use of that drug would be fatal. So they started reducing the dosage. And as they did so, the aggression returned.
There were lots of little things where he'd get angry and start throwing things. What really scared me was what happened with his caretaker over at his group home.
One day, Michael was packing his lunch in the apartment, and Michael was taking what she felt was an overwhelming amount of grapes, putting in.
Save some grapes for everybody else.
Well, that really upset Michael to the point where he actually threw her across the room and started kicking her.
After that, I begged the doctors to put him back on the same medication, but they still insisted it was too dangerous.
This has got to be frustrating to Barbara. She probably had that horrible feeling that, we're walking on thin ice here. How long is this going to go on before something bad happens?
Well, we're just trying to learn exactly what happened in the bathroom that day.
I understand. Rowan's family deserves to know.
Mrs. Zelenka, is he able to communicate with us?
Well, yes, but with people he doesn't know, he clams up. You just need the right person to ask the questions.
Now, I'm not going to ask his own mother to try getting him to confess to a murder to us. I am cruel, but I'm not that cruel. So who else would he talk to?
There's a woman named Liz Miller, who was his primary supervisor at Pioneer Enterprises. He was close with her. He might talk to her.
All right, well, thank you so much, ma'am.
Several days later, Kenda arranges an interview between Michael and his former supervisor, Liz Miller.
We told Liz Miller, let's at least get a statement out of him as to what happened in that men's room, because otherwise we'll never know.
Hi, Michael. How are you? Michael, can you tell me what happened in the bathroom the other day with Rowan?
Yes. Rowan. Bathroom.
Michael's central speech disorder made every word difficult unless he was very familiar with the words.
Did Rowan do something to hurt your feelings in the bathroom that day?
Yeah.
She asked him, were you mad at Rowan? And ultimately the answer was yes, but I don't know why.
Did you kick Rowan?
Uh-huh.
How many times did you kick Rowan? 4?
Michael wasn't very good at counting, and he also wasn't very good at remembering.
Liz, I think we can wrap this up.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to learn much more. Michael, thank you for telling the truth.
Kenda may not have a detailed confession, but he has enough to work with.
Do I actually know what happened in that men's room? I do not. What I suspect happened is this. Rowan Monteith takes medication to help him with his Down syndrome. It makes him somewhat lethargic. Michael wants to wash his hands. And who is in the way but Rowan Monteith?
Rowan learned his self-care skills very well. He would not hurry through the process of his personal hygiene routine.
Michael becomes impatient. Get out of my way. I have to wash my hands.
Stop, my girl.
Rowan probably indicated that Michael needed to wait. But waiting was not something that Michael did very well at all.
And that triggers him. Vicious kicks causing contusion to the spinal cord, causing brain death. He kills his friend over impatience at using the sink. Excuse me? But that's what happened.
After extensive testing, Michael Zerlinka is ruled incompetent to stand trial.
The charge of second-degree murder was dropped against Mr. Zerlinka, and he was removed from the state hospital by his family.
Ottawa is the kind of city that can make a terrible secret look ordinary.
It has quiet residential streets lined with modest houses, small backyards hidden behind fences, apartment buildings where neighbors pass one another in hallways without knowing each other's names, parks where children play during the day, and empty paths disappear beneath the trees after dark. From a distance, nothing seems unusual. That is what makes certain crimes so difficult to see. They do not always begin with a scream. Sometimes they begin with an argument behind a closed door. Sometimes they begin with a woman who simply stops answering the telephone. That does not belong to him. While the world around him accepts the explanation, he is carefully prepared. And sometimes, the truth does not emerge for years. In Ottawa, one man managed to live with a secret for nearly 2 decades. His name was Camille Cleroux. By the time police began pulling apart the stories surrounding him, the years had already done much of the work of hiding the past. Memories had faded, people had moved, relationships had ended, addresses had changed, places that once mattered had become ordinary pieces of the city. But beneath that ordinary surface were 3 women: Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire. 3 women connected to the same man, 3 disappearances separated by years, and 3 stories that, for a long time, appear to belong to completely different chapters of his life. The first chapter began in 1990. Lise Roy was Cleroux's wife. Their relationship existed behind the walls of a home, in the private world where arguments, resentments, and moments of anger can remain invisible to everyone outside. One day, an argument between them escalated. What happened next would eventually become the first known killing connected to Cleroux. Lise did not simply disappear. According to the case that would emerge years later, Cleroux took deliberate steps to conceal what he had done. Her remains were separated and buried in different locations, including an area connected to the home where they had lived and another location in Ottawa. Then the years passed. A woman who had once shared a home with him became a name buried beneath the surface of the city. For the people who knew Lise, there was no simple way to understand her absence. A person does not vanish from a life without leaving behind questions. Where did she go? Why did she leave? Why didn't she call? Why didn't anyone see her? Why was there no final conversation, no clear goodbye, no moment that could be pointed to and said, "This was the last time anyone saw her"? Those questions can become unbearable when there is no body, no confession, and no definitive answer. And for years, there was none. The first secret remained buried. Then came 2003. 13 years had passed. Cleroux's life had changed. Lise was gone. But another woman had entered his world. Her name was Jean Rock. She was not merely a passing acquaintance. She was his partner, connected to Cleroux disappeared. Jean Rock vanished in 2003. At first glance, a disappearance can be explained in many ways. Adults leave relationships. Adults move to another city. People begin new lives without telling everyone around them. People stop calling. People make choices that those left behind do not understand. That uncertainty is precisely what makes a disappearance so difficult. The people waiting for answers are forced to live between 2 possibilities. Maybe the person is alive somewhere. Maybe they simply do not want to be found. Or maybe something much darker happened. Jean's family was left with that uncertainty. And Cleroux had an explanation. There were even letters. Letters designed to make it appear that Jean was still alive. Messages that suggested she had left and was continuing her life somewhere else. On the surface, they could have offered reassurance, but a disappearance does not become less disturbing simply because there is a piece of paper saying that everything is fine. Sometimes, the most important question is not what a message says. It is who wanted the message to exist. Years later, that question would become devastating, because police would learn that Jean Rock had not simply that he had killed her, but that admission was still years away. For the moment, another secret remained hidden. And then came 2010. 20 years had passed since Lise Roy disappeared. 7 years had passed since Jean Rock vanished. And Cleroux was still living in Ottawa. still moving through ordinary streets, still surrounded by ordinary people, still carrying a history that almost no one could see. Then there was Paula LeClaire. She was 64 years old. Unlike Lise and Jean, Paula was not Clarua's wife or romantic partner. She was his neighbor. That distinction matters, because the circumstances surrounding Paula's disappearance would eventually expose something that the earlier disappearances had not. A motive that could be seen, a physical location, an apartment, and a man who appeared to want something that belonged to a woman who was suddenly no longer there. Paula LeClaire lived in an apartment that Claru wanted. The reason, according to the case, was simple and unsettling. He wanted her apartment because of its location and its view. There was nothing mysterious about wanting a better home. People move for better views. They seek larger apartments. They look for quieter neighborhoods. Wanting something is one thing. What someone is willing to do to obtain it is another. Paula disappeared, and then something strange began to happen. Instead of behaving like a neighbor who had lost contact with an older woman, Claru began behaving as though Paula's absence had created an opportunity. He moved his belongings into her apartment. He attempted to create the appearance that Paula had willingly given it to him. On the surface, he wanted the story to look simple. Paula had made a decision. Paula had chosen to leave. Paula had somehow transferred the apartment to him. Nothing to investigate. Nothing to question. Nothing to fear. But people who knew Paula began to notice that the story did not fit. And among them was her son. He noticed things that did not make sense. The apartment. His mother's disappearance. The circumstances surrounding the supposed transfer. The sudden presence of Claru inside a space that had belonged to Paula. One detail led to another. Questions became suspicions. Suspicion became a police investigation. And suddenly, after 20 years of silence, the past began to move. When investigators looked at Paula's disappearance, they were not simply looking at a missing year appeared deeply connected to her absence. The walls around the story began to close in, and as investigators dug deeper, they began asking a question that would transform the case. What else had happened around Camille Claru? Because Paula was not the first woman connected to him to disappear. There had been another woman, Lise Roy. And before Paula, there had been Jean Rock. The timeline was difficult to ignore. 1990, 1991, 1992. 3 women. 3 different points in time, and one man connecting them. At first, the years between the disappearances could have seemed reassuring. 20 years is a long time. 13 years is a long time. 7 years is a long time. A person could change enormously over those periods. A relationship could end. A life could move in a completely different direction. But investigators were no longer looking at the years separately. They were looking at the pattern. And patterns can change the meaning of individual events. A woman disappears. It could be voluntary. A second woman disappears. It could still be coincidence. A third woman disappears, and the same man is somehow connected to all. It begins to feel like a question. And questions, once asked by police, have a way of opening doors that someone has spent years trying to keep closed. The investigation surrounding Paula eventually brought Claru into custody, and once he was arrested, the story began to unravel. Not all at once. Not like a confession in a movie, where a suspect suddenly sits beneath a bright light and tells investigators everything. The truth came through fragments, names, locations, memories, statements, and eventually admissions. The investigators began looking backward. They revisited the women who had disappeared from Clarua's life. They examined what had been known about Lise. They examined what had been believed about Jean. They searched places that had been ordinary for years. A backyard. A park. Wooded areas around Ottawa. Places where people had walked without knowing that the ground beneath their feet might contain evidence from a crime committed years earlier. The search for Lisa's remains was especially haunting because of the passage of time. Imagine a backyard 20 years after a disappearance. The grass has grown and died countless times, has covered the ground. Spring has brought rain. Summer has brought heat. Autumn has buried everything under leaves. People have lived their lives. Children may have grown up. Neighbors may have moved away. And underneath it all, something remained. Eventually, investigators recovered human remains connected to Lee's. A mystery that had survived for decades suddenly had physical evidence. The past was no longer only a story told by frightened relatives or an unanswered name on a missing person file. It was there. Real. Irreversible. And then came Jean, the woman whose disappearance had been surrounded by letters suggesting that she had left voluntarily. Those letters now looked very different. What had once appeared to be evidence that Jean was alive could instead be understood as part of an attempt to make people believe exactly that. A false trail. A manufactured explanation. A life that existed on paper, but not in reality. For Jean's family, the revelation would have carried a particular cruelty. A disappearance leaves room for hope. A lie can keep that hope alive for years. And when the lie is finally exposed, the family does not simply lose the person they loved. They live. That is one of the darkest dimensions of a long-hidden crime. Time does not always heal the wound. Sometimes time only allows the wrong story to become more deeply rooted. By 2012, the investigation had reached its final chapter in court. On June 26, Camille Claireau pleaded guilty to all 3 killings. For Paula LeClaire, the charge was first-degree murder. For Lise Roy and Jean Rock, the charges were second-degree murder. There would be no long trial in which a jury spent weeks listening to every detail and deciding whether the evidence was enough. There would be a plea. There would be a sentence. And there would be the unavoidable fact that 3 women had lost their lives. Claireau received a life sentence. He would have to serve at least 25 years before becoming eligible for parole. But a sentence cannot reverse time. It cannot return Lise to the life she should have lived. It cannot give Jean's family back the years spent wondering where she had gone. It cannot return Paula to the apartment that had become part of the motive behind her death. And it cannot erase the fact that for years, ordinary life continued around secrets that were anything but ordinary. There is something deeply unsettling about this case because none of the places involved niches surrounded by darkness. No abandoned castle. No distant forest cabin where no one ever went. There were homes, apartments, neighborhoods, parks, backyards, everyday places. Places where mail was delivered, where neighbors carried groceries, where people opened curtains in the morning and locked doors at night. That is often where the most disturbing truth of a crime like this lives. The horror is not always somewhere far away. Sometimes it exists in the familiar. It exists behind the door next door. It exists in the person whose name you recognize, but whose history you never bother to ask about. It exists in a story that sounds plausible because everyone wants it to be true. Paula had left. Jean had moved away. Lise was simply gone. For years, these explanations could occupy the empty spaces where the truth should have been. But eventually, those explanations collided with evidence. And when they did, the picture of Camille Claireau became impossible to look at in the same way. He was no longer simply a man living an ordinary life in Ottawa. He was a man connected to 3 women whose lives had ended violently. Spent years attempting to control not only what happened to his victims, but what other people believed had happened to them. That distinction is important because killing someone ends a life, but constructing a false story afterward can distort the lives of everyone left behind. Families grieve differently when there is no body. They search differently when they believe someone may still be alive. They make decisions differently when they think a loved one simply chose to disappear. And every birthday, every holiday, every unanswered telephone call can become another reminder of a question that has no answer. Until one day, the truth arrives. Not gently. Not completely. It arrives piece by piece. A missing woman. A suspicious apartment, a police interview, a name from the past, a location, a search, human remains, a confession, and suddenly, 20 years of silence become one story. But there is still another question. How could it have gone on for so long? How could one disappearance fail to expose the next? How could a second woman vanish from the same man's life without immediately revealing the first that people could accept? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what does the pattern tell us about the way he viewed the people around him? Was each killing an isolated act born from a particular conflict? Was there a deeper pattern of control? Did the motives change over time? Or had the same fundamental desire to control people, circumstances, and outcomes been present from the beginning? Those questions would become central to understanding the case, because the story of Camille Claireaux is not only a story about 3 murders, it is a story about disappearance, about manipulation, about the power of an explanation when people desperately want an explanation to be true, and about how long a secret can survive when the person carrying it understands exactly what others need to believe. For 20 years, the city continued to move. Cars passed the streets where these women had lived. People walked through the parks. Neighbors looked out from their windows. The seasons changed. 1990 became 1991, then 2000, then 2003, then 2010, and finally 2012. The dates accumulated quietly, like layers of dust over something buried. But on. Eventually, the ground gave up part of the truth. A family refused to accept an explanation that did not make sense. A police investigation connected one disappearance to another, and the man at the center of it all could no longer keep every story separate. The women had been separated by time. The investigation brought them back together. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire, 3 lives. 3 different relationships with the same man. 3 disappearances. And 1 secret that had survived for decades. Until it didn't. The story begins with a missing woman, but it ends by forcing us to ask something much darker. How many times can a person disappear before someone realizes that the disappearances are connected? And how much time can pass before the silence itself becomes evidence? For Lise, the answer was 20 years. For Jean, 7. For Paula, much less. Because by 2010, something had changed. Someone noticed. Someone questioned the story. Someone looked at what was happening and decided that the explanation did not make sense. And that single decision began to pull apart everything Camille Claireaux had built. The past would lead investigators to names. The names would lead them to places. The places would lead them to remains. And the remains would lead to the truth. But before the police could reconstruct what happened, there was another story that needed to be told. The stories of the women themselves. Because in a case like this, the danger is that the killer's name becomes larger than the names of the people he killed. The investigation becomes the story. The suspect becomes the central character. The courtroom becomes the final stage. And the victims become little more than dates attached to a crime. That cannot be allowed to happen here. Before we follow Camille Claireaux into the darkness, we need to step back. We need to meet the women as people, not case numbers. We need to remember that before Lise Roy became a name in a murder investigation, she was someone's wife, someone's family member, someone's familiar voice on the other end of a telephone. Before Jean Rock became a disappearance, she was a woman with relationships, routines, memories, and people who expected her to come home. And before Paula LeClaire became the center of a police investigation, she was a 64-year-old woman living in an apartment that represented her own small piece of the world. The crime and the entirety of them. That is where the story must go next. Away from the man who eventually stood before a judge, and toward the women whose lives existed long before their names appeared in his story. Because the first question should never be only, what did he do? The first question should be, who were they? And for Lise Roy, that question takes us back to 1990. before anyone knew that a quiet home in Ottawa was about to become the beginning of a secret that would last for 2 decades. Before anyone searched the ground, before detectives began connecting names, before a courtroom would hear the words first-degree murder and second-degree murder, there was simply a woman who was missing. That is how these stories usually begin. Not with a crime scene, not with police tape, not with a confession, with an absence, a chair that stays empty, a telephone that does not ring, a door that never opens, a familiar face that should have appeared somewhere but doesn't. For the people closest to a missing person, the first days can be filled with explanations. Maybe she is staying with someone. Maybe she needed time alone. Maybe she has gone somewhere without telling anyone. Maybe she will call tomorrow. Tomorrow becomes the next day. The next day, the questions become heavier than the explanations. That was the kind of uncertainty surrounding Lise Roy. In 1990, there was no way for anyone around her to know that her disappearance would eventually become part of a much larger story. There was no way to look at the calendar and understand that this was the first marker in a timeline that would stretch across decades. 1990. One woman, one relationship, one argument, and then silence. The details of what happened inside that home would remain hidden for years. According to the case, an argument between Lise and Camille Cleroux escalated until Cleroux killed her. Afterward, he did something that would make the crime even more difficult to uncover. He concealed the evidence. He separated Lisa's remains and buried them in different places. One of those locations was connected to the property where the couple had lived. Another was Hetherington Park. Think about what that means in the simplest possible terms. The places where people lived their ordinary lives became places where the past was hidden. A backyard is supposed to be a place for ordinary things. A patch of grass. A fence. A garden. A place where sunlight falls, stand with a cup of coffee, and never imagine what is beneath the soil. A park is supposed to be even more public. Children play there. People walk. Dogs run through the grass. Neighbors pass one another. The world continues. And yet the same ground can hold 2 completely different realities. Above it, life. Below it, evidence. That contrast would become one of the most haunting elements of the investigation. For years, nobody knew. The people walking through Ottawa did not know. The people living near those locations did not know. And the families connected to Lise did not have the certainty they deserved. The absence of a body creates a particular kind of suffering. A death can be devastating, but a disappearance can be cruel in a different way. There is always the possibility, however small, that the person is alive. That possibility can keep hope alive. It can also prevent grief from ever becoming complete. You cannot properly say goodbye to someone when you do not know where they are. You cannot stand beside a grave. You cannot place flowers on the ground. You cannot look at a final resting place and tell yourself that, at least, you know where they are. Instead, there is only the question, where did she remain unanswered for years? Then came Jean Rock. 13 years is enough time for an entire life to change. A child can become an adult. A marriage can begin and end. A neighborhood can look completely different. A person can move, find new friends, change jobs, create new routines. The world has a way of moving forward, whether we are ready for it or not. By 2003, Lise Roy had been gone for 13 years, and another woman had become part of Cleroux's life. Jean Rock. Jean was his partner. Then she disappeared. The repetition is difficult to ignore now, but at the time, repetition is not always visible. Each event exists inside its own context. A person disappears. There is a reason offered. There is a story. There are explanations. And unless someone has the full picture, the individual pieces may never appear connected. Cleroux had an explanation for Jean's disappearance. And then came the letters. Letters that made it appear Jean had left. Letters that could give a worried family a reason to believe that she was somewhere else. That detail would become especially important later, because a written message can carry tremendous We trust familiar handwriting. We trust the idea that a person would not write something unless they meant it. A letter can cross hundreds of miles and make someone feel that the person they miss is still within reach. It can turn an empty chair into a temporary absence. It can transform grief into waiting, and waiting can last a very long time. Imagine being a family member who believes someone you love has simply chosen another life. You might be hurt. You might be angry. You might feel abandoned. But somewhere underneath those feelings is hope. The hope that one day the telephone will ring. The hope that a letter will arrive. The hope that the person will walk through the door. And if someone has deliberately created the hope through deception, then the cruelty does not end with the death itself. The deception becomes part of the crime. Years later, after Clairou was arrested in connection with Paula LeClaire, he admitted that he had killed Jean. The letters were no longer evidence of a new life. They became evidence of a false one. The woman everyone believed had walked away had never had the chance to walk anywhere. And the people who had waited for her had been waiting for someone who was already gone. Then there was Paula. Her story was different, and made the case finally crack open. Paula LeClaire was 64. She lived next door to Clairou. She had an apartment, and Clairou wanted it. Not because of some complicated inheritance dispute, not because of a mysterious business transaction. The apartment itself appealed to him because of its location and its view. It was something he wanted to possess. And according to the case, Paula's disappearance created the opportunity. After she was gone, Clairou moved his belongings into her apartment. That action would become one of the details investigators could not ignore, because a missing person leaves behind a space. And the question becomes, who enters that space after they are gone? What happens to their belongings? Who has access? Who benefits? Who suddenly behaves as though they have inherited something they were never supposed to have? Clairou attempted to make the situation appear legitimate. He tried to create evidence suggesting Paula had willingly given him the apartment. The story was supposed to be simple, but simple stories can collapse when too many details do not fit. Paula's son noticed. That matters. Because investigations often begin not with a detective refusing to accept an explanation. Someone notices that something is wrong. Someone asks a question. Someone makes a phone call. Someone says, "This doesn't make sense." That sentence can be the beginning of everything. In Paula's case, her son's concerns helped bring police into the picture. And once investigators began looking, the apartment stopped being merely an apartment. It became evidence. The belongings inside it became evidence. The story about Paula's supposed decision became evidence. And Clairou himself became the focus. The police were no longer simply asking where Paula was. They were asking why a man connected to her disappearance was already acting as though her life had been erased. That was the first crack. And once a crack appears in a carefully constructed story, investigators begin testing it. They ask the same question from different angles. They compare statements. They look at timelines. They speak to neighbors. They examine relationships. They look backward. And looking backward was dangerous for Clairou, because there was history there. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula LeClaire. The names were not random. They belonged to women who had occupied a partner, a neighbor. Different relationships, different years, different circumstances, but the same man remained at the center. That is when a disappearance stops looking like an isolated event. It becomes a pattern. Patterns are powerful because they change how investigators interpret everything that came before. Imagine looking at a single photograph. You see one face, one expression, one moment. Then someone gives you a second photograph, and a third. Suddenly, details that seemed meaningless begin to matter. A person standing in the background, a location, a repeated behavior, a familiar name. The same thing happens in criminal investigations. The past can change when new information arrives. A missing person who once seemed to have voluntarily left may suddenly look very different when another woman connected to the same man is found dead. A strange letter becomes suspicious. An unexplained absence becomes significant. A story that once seemed plausible becomes difficult to defend. And Clarua's past began to come into focus. The police learned about Lise. They learned about Jean. They began searching for answers that should have. The investigation reached the physical places connected to the women. The backyard. The park. The wooded areas. The locations where memory and evidence had been separated by time. There is something almost unbearable about a forensic search in a place that has existed for years without anyone knowing what happened there. Investigators arrive with equipment. They examine the ground. They look for disturbances. They search systematically. Every movement matters. Every patch of soil becomes a question. Every object can potentially tell a story. And when the remains connected to Lise were eventually discovered, the meaning of the past changed forever. She was no longer simply missing. The uncertainty ended, but certainty brought its own kind of pain. The woman who had been missing had not chosen to leave. She had not started another life. She had been killed. And the man who had been closest to her was responsible. For investigators, this was a breakthrough. For a family, it was something more complicated. It was the answer they had needed, and the answer they never wanted. That contradiction lies at the heart of many long-term missing person cases. People want the truth, but sometimes the truth is the thing truth came after years. For Jean, it came through Clarua's own admission. For Paula, it began with the decision of her son to question what he was seeing. 3 paths. 3 women. 1 investigation. And 1 man whose carefully maintained world was beginning to collapse. By the time Claru finally admitted to the killings, the investigators had something far more significant than a suspicion. They had a chronology. They had names. They had physical evidence. They had statements. And they had the accused himself. The story that had once depended on silence could no longer survive. But there was still a disturbing question underneath everything. Why these women? Why at those moments? Why did the violence appear in different forms depending on the relationship? With Lise, the case centered around an argument inside a marriage. With Jean, there was a disappearance followed by fabricated letters. With Paula, there was an apartment Claru wanted. The circumstances were different. The outcome was the same. A woman was gone. And Claru remained. That repetition forces us to look beyond the individual acts and toward the psychology of control, not to excuse it, to turn a murderer into a character more fascinating than the people he destroyed, but to understand the mechanism. Because control can be quiet. It does not always look like rage. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like a story repeated until people accept it. Sometimes it looks like a person calmly moving their belongings into a home that belongs to someone else. Sometimes it looks like a letter designed to make a family stop asking questions. And sometimes it looks like nothing at all. That may be the most frightening part. A person does not need to look like a monster to commit monstrous acts. He can stand in a hallway. He can speak to a neighbor. He can answer a question. He can appear ordinary. And ordinary behavior can become a mask. That is why the story of Camille Claru cannot be understood simply by asking what he did. We have to ask how the people around him interpreted what they saw. Why did the explanations work? Why did the disappearances remain unresolved? Why did the people who love these women have to wait so long? And what finally made the story impossible to maintain? The answer begins with Paula Leclerc. Her apartment became the point where the present collided with the past. Her son saw something that did not fit. Questions opened a door. Behind that door was Jean. Behind Jean was Lise. And behind the names were places. Places that had remained silent for years. The city had changed. The people had changed. But the evidence had been waiting. Waiting beneath soil. Waiting inside memories. Waiting inside old relationships. Waiting in the stories people had been told. And when investigators finally began connecting everything, The timeline became almost impossible to ignore. 1990, 1991, 1992, 20 years between the first known killing and the third. 3 women connected to one man. The first disappearance buried beneath time. The second hidden behind false correspondence. The third exposed because someone questioned the story. That is the sequence that makes this case so disturbing. Not simply that 3 women were killed, but that each disappearance existed long enough to become part of the background. Life continued. People adjusted. Questions remained unanswered. And the man at the center of the story continued living, until Paula's disappearance created a problem he could not completely control. He wanted her apartment, but in trying to take it, he wanted most, may have become the thing that exposed him. And that is where the story turns, because the apartment was not merely the place where Paula had lived. It became the doorway through which investigators entered Clarua's past. Once they stepped through that doorway, they found far more than they expected. They found a history. They found a pattern. And eventually, they found the buried remains of a woman whose family had spent years without knowing where she was. But even then, the story was not finished. A murder investigation is not only about discovering what happened, it is about reconstructing what happened. Who was there? What happened first? What happened next? What did the suspect do afterward? What did he say? What did he hide? What did he want people to believe? And what finally forced the truth into the open? Those questions would become the framework for everything that followed. On June 26, 2012, Claru would stand before the court and plead guilty to 3 murders. But before that day, investigators had to piece together more than 20 years of a man's life. They had to walk backward through time. They had to revisit people who remembered him. They had to revisit women whose names had become places where the ordinary and the terrible had existed side by side, without anyone realizing it. The courtroom would eventually provide an ending, but justice could not erase the years before it. It could not restore the lives that had been taken. It could not return the years of uncertainty to the families. It could only establish responsibility, and perhaps that is why the beginning of this story matters so much. Because long before the sentence was handed down, there were 3 women living ordinary lives. They had mornings. They had evenings. They had conversations. They had belongings. They had people who knew them. They had plans. And none of them knew how their lives would end. Lise could not have known that an argument inside her home would become the beginning of a 20-year secret. Jean could not have known that the letters supposedly explaining her disappearance would one day be understood as part of a deception. Paula could not have known that the apartment she called home would become the object of a man's desire and, ultimately, the trigger for an investigation that exposed everything. That is the tragedy hidden beneath the timeline. Dates are clean. Human lives are not. 1990 is only 4 digits. 2003 is only 4 digits. But between those numbers were years of life. Years that belong to people. Years that cannot be recovered. And when we tell a true crime story, it is easy to move too quickly. From murder to investigation. From investigation to confession. From confession to sentence. But the victims did not experience their lives as chapters in a case file. They experienced them one day at a time. That is why, before we follow the investigation deeper into the darkness, we have to slow down. We have to step away from the suspect. We have to stop looking at the calendar. And we have to look at the women, not as names in a timeline, not as evidence, not as the people whose deaths eventually led police to a conviction, but as human beings. Lise Roy existed before 1990. Jean Rock existed before 2003. Paula LeClaire existed before 2010. Their stories did not begin with the moment they disappeared. They began long before that. And the next part of the story will begin there. Because when everything else is stripped away, the investigation, the headlines, the courtroom, the sentence, the murderer himself, what remains are 3 lives that mattered. 3 women who should have had more years, more conversations, more memories, and 3 families who deserve the truth much sooner. For years, that truth was hidden. Then one disappearance exposed another. One investigation reopened an old mystery. One name led to another. And beneath the quiet surface of Ottawa, the past began to speak. The first voice belongs to Lise Roy. Before she became the first known victim in this case, she was simply Lise, a woman with a life of her own, a woman whose final chapter was written without her consent, and a woman whose story had been waiting for more than 2 decades to be told. There is a particular kind of silence that surrounds a disappearance. It is not the silence of an empty room. It is the silence created when everyone expects a person to return. At first, people leave the light on. They keep the telephone nearby. They check the door whenever they hear footsteps in the hallway. They tell themselves there must be an explanation. Then the days begin to accumulate. The light is turned off. The telephone stops being watched every minute. The footsteps become meaningless. But the question remains, where is she? For the families of Lise Roy, Jean Rock informs. For Lise, it would survive for years. For Jean, it would be sustained by a carefully constructed illusion. For Paula, it would become the question that finally brought police to the door. 3 women. 3 different circumstances. And yet, when the entire story is viewed from the distance of history, their lives appear connected by a single thread. Camille Claireaux. There is something unsettling about that name now. But names do not carry their meaning with them when we first encounter them. A name is just a name. A neighbor is just a neighbor. A husband is just a husband. A partner is just a partner. A man standing in a hallway can look like any other man standing in a hallway. There is no visible warning attached to him. No mark on his forehead. No sign that tells strangers what he has done. That is one of the uncomfortable truths of violent crime. The human mind wants danger to look dangerous. We want the predator to appear different. We want the villain to announce himself. But real life rarely gives us that certainty. Instead, people make judgments based on fragments. A conversation, a reputation, a relationship, a story, a smon's ability to sound convincing. And sometimes that is enough. For years, Claireaux's version of events existed in that space between what people knew and what they could prove. Lise was gone. Jean was gone. But the world had explanations. The explanations did not necessarily have to be perfect. They only had to be plausible enough. That is an important distinction. A lie does not always have to be brilliant. Sometimes it only needs to fit the expectations of the people hearing it. If someone says a woman left, people may believe it because adults sometimes leave. If someone says she does not want contact, people may believe it because relationships sometimes break down. If a letter arrives suggesting that everything is fine, people may accept it because the alternative is unbearable. Hope can make a weak explanation feel stronger, and grief can make people afraid to challenge it. That is what makes the story of Jean Rock so haunting. Her disappearance was not followed by an obvious crime scene. There was no immediate answer. Instead, there was uncertainty. And uncertainty can be manipulated. The letters became part of that manipulation. They gave shape to a story. Jean had left. Jean was somewhere else. Jean had chosen which idea created a different emotional response, but all of them had the same effect. They moved attention away from the possibility that she had been killed. That possibility was difficult to accept, and perhaps that was precisely why the false story could survive. Then there was Paula. Paula's disappearance was different because the person who benefited from it made himself visible. The moment Claireaux moved his belongings into her apartment, he created a physical connection between her absence and his own behavior. That was dangerous. People can disappear, but objects remain. Apartments remain. Furniture remains. Neighbors remember. Family members remember where things were. They remember how someone lived. They notice when something changes. And they notice when another person begins behaving as though the missing person's life has already been transferred to them. Paula's son noticed. That detail may sound small when written in a case summary. It is not small. It is the kind of detail that can change an entire investigation. Someone notices. Someone refuses to accept the obvious explanation. Someone decides to ask another question. And suddenly, the story begins moving in a direction. Investigators began looking at Paula's disappearance differently. The apartment was no longer simply a place where a woman had lived. It was a potential crime scene. The objects inside were no longer merely possessions. They were potential evidence. The man's behavior was no longer merely strange. It was potentially significant. And the past was no longer safely buried. Once police began examining Claire's history, they encountered another name. Lise Roy. Then another. Jean Rock. At that point, time itself became evidence. The years between the disappearances could no longer simply be treated as empty space. 1990, 1991, 1992. The numbers sat there in sequence, not proof by themselves, but enough to make investigators ask questions. What happened in 1990? What happened in 2003? What happened in 2010? And why was the same man connected to all three? That is the moment when an investigation can become something much larger. A missing person case becomes a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation becomes a historical reconstruction. And history force never have gone. Old addresses, old relationships, old memories, old properties, old stories. Some of those stories had probably been told so many times that people no longer remembered where they began. But detectives do not have the luxury of accepting stories simply because they have been repeated. They compare. They test. They challenge. They look for contradictions. They ask what should be there but is missing. They ask what should not be there but suddenly appears. And they look for the physical traces that memory cannot erase. That search eventually led investigators toward the locations associated with Lise. A property. A backyard. A park. The ground beneath Ottawa. There is something strangely democratic about soil. It does not care who walks above it. It does not care whether someone is rich or poor. It does not care whether the person buried beneath it was remembered every day or forgotten in by almost everyone. It simply holds what is placed inside it. For years, the ground had held the secret. Then investigators came looking. The search for human remains is unlike the search for an ordinary object. There is changes the meaning of the case. A fragment can transform a missing person investigation. A location can transform a suspicion into evidence. A set of remains can give a family something they have been denied for years. But it can also confirm the worst fear they have carried. When remains connected to Lise were discovered, the question of whether she had voluntarily disappeared was over. The silence had an answer. It was a terrible answer, but it was an answer. And with that answer came another question. Who had done this? The investigation pointed toward the same man. Camille Claireau, the man who had been connected to Lise, the man connected to Jean, the man connected to Paula. The three women were no longer separate stories. They were part of one investigation, and that meant the investigators had to reconsider everything they thought they knew. What had happened inside the relationships? What had happened during the arguments? What did Claireau do after each woman disappeared? What did he tell other people? How did he explain their absence? Where did he go? What did he gain? What did he fear losing? Those questions matter because homicide is not only about the moment of death. It is also about everything that surrounds it. Before. The preparation. The opportunity. The concealment. The explanation. The attempt to control what other people believe. And in Claireau's case, the period after the killings became particularly significant. He did not simply disappear himself. He remained. He continued living. He continued existing in the same world as the people who did not know what had happened. That creates a disturbing psychological contrast. The victims are absent. The perpetrator remains present. Families search for answers. The person responsible knows the answer. Families wonder whether their loved one is alive. He knows she is not. Families wait for a telephone call. He knows the telephone will never bring the person back. And if false explanations are added to that imbalance, the suffering becomes even deeper. The person who knows the truth controls the truth, at least for a while. But control has limits. People make mistakes. Stories leave traces. Physical evidence survives. And other human beings remember things. That is what eventually happened. Clairou could control what he said. He could attempt to shape what others believed. He could control the people around him. He could not control Paula's son, noticing that something was wrong. He could not control investigators asking questions. He could not control the passage of time. And he could not control the evidence that remained behind. That is the paradox at the center of the case. The longer a secret survives, the more permanent the world around it becomes. People move, but records remain. Buildings change, but memories remain. Relationships end, but names remain. And the ground remains. 20 years can bury a secret, but 20 years can also create 20 years of evidence. When the investigation finally turned toward Clairou, those years began working against him. The story that had once existed as separate pieces was being assembled. One piece from 1990, another from 2003, another from 2010, and each piece made the others harder to dismiss. For investigators, this was the beginning of reconstruction. For the families, it was the beginning of an answer. But for the audience telling this story today, there is a danger. We can look at the timeline and assume that the ending was inevitable. It was not. The ending because someone questioned something, because someone refused to let a disappearance remain an unexplained absence. That is why Paula Leclerc's story is so important. Without her disappearance, the earlier cases might have remained buried even longer. Her death became the event that forced the past into the present. The apartment Clairou wanted became the place where his story began to collapse. He had wanted something tangible, a home, a view, a space. But in trying to obtain it, he created the very evidence that exposed him. That irony is difficult to escape. The apartment was supposed to represent possession. Instead, it became the beginning of accountability. And once accountability arrived, there was nowhere left for the earlier stories to hide. Lise could be found. Jean could be named. Paula could be remembered. And Clairou could be charged. The years of uncertainty were finally moving toward a courtroom. But a courtroom can only answer certain questions. Was he responsible? What charges applied? What sentence would follow? The court could establish legal responsibility. It could not reconstruct the mornings that Lise would never see. It could not recreate Jean's life. She should have continued living. That is why justice and closure are not the same thing. A sentence can punish. A conviction can establish truth. But neither can undo the past. On June 26, 2012, Clairou pleaded guilty to all 3 murders. The legal story moved quickly compared with the 22 years that had preceded it. First-degree murder for Paula Leclerc. Second-degree murder for Lise Roy. Second-degree murder for Jean Rock. Life imprisonment. At least 25 years before eligibility for parole. The numbers are precise. The law requires precision. But human loss is not precise. There is no number that can measure the value of a life. There is no sentence that can calculate the years stolen from a family. There is no legal phrase that can fully describe what it means to spend years wondering where someone you love has gone. And so, even after the conviction, the story did not truly end. Because the family still had to live. The city still had to move forward. The names still had to be remembered. And the women still needed to be seen as more than victims. That is why the next part of the story must slow down. We have spent the opening minutes looking at the darkness. Now we need to look toward lives. We need to return to the beginning. Not the beginning of the murders. The beginning of the women. Lise Roy was not born a case file. Jean Rock was not born a missing person report. Paula LeClaire was not born a name in a criminal indictment. They lived before they were victims. They had identities that had nothing to do with Camille Claireau. That matters. Because the most powerful thing a true crime story can do is resist the temptation to let the offender become the center of everything. He committed the crimes, but the victims own the lives that came before them. Their lives deserve space. Their humanity deserves attention. And their names deserve to be spoken without being reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. So as we leave the opening of this story, remember the timeline. 1990, Lise Roy disappears. 2003, Jean Rock disappears. 2010, Paula LeClaire disappears. 2012, Camille Claireau admits responsibility for all 3 killings and receives a life sentence. 2021, Claireau dies in prison from what Canadian correctional authorities initially described as natural causes. But none of them cannot tell us what Lisa's home looked like on an ordinary morning. They cannot tell us what Jean's family thought when she stopped responding. They cannot tell us what Paula's son felt when he realized that something about his mother's disappearance was wrong. For that, we have to leave the timeline. We have to leave the courtroom. We have to leave the killer's confession behind. And we have to return to the beginning. Because the true story does not begin with the man who killed them. It begins with the women who were alive. Before the disappearance. Before the investigation. Before the evidence. Before the courtroom. There was Lise Roy. And somewhere in Ottawa, in 1990, she was living a life that had not yet been reduced to a date. She was a wife. She was a daughter. She was a familiar presence to people who loved her. She was a human being with ordinary expectations about the future. She did not know that an argument would become the final chapter of her life. She did not know that the ground would eventually conceal what happened to her. She did not know that 20 years would pass before investigators would uncover the truth. And she certainly did not know that another woman would one day disappear from the same man's life. Then another. That is what makes the opening of this case only becomes visible after the fact. When you already know the ending, the beginning looks different. A quiet home no longer looks completely quiet. A disappearance no longer looks isolated. A letter no longer looks innocent. An apartment no longer looks like an apartment. Every detail seems to contain a warning. But the people living through those moments did not have the luxury of hindsight. They were inside the story. They could not see the whole picture. Neither could the investigators at first. Neither could the families. Neither could the people living nearby. That is the human weakness that allows some crimes to remain hidden. We experience life one moment at a time. We do not normally connect everything. We do not wake up each morning wondering whether an ordinary conversation will become evidence in a murder investigation 20 years later. We trust the world to remain ordinary. Most of the time it does. But when it doesn't, the ordinary details become the things investigators return to. A door. A letter. An apartment. A backyard. A park. A name. A date. A memory. A missing woman. Stay buried. The story of Camille Claireau is therefore not only about what happened in 3 separate years. It is about what can happen when a secret is allowed to grow. It is about how a lie can become part of someone's reality. It is about how the absence of evidence can be mistaken for evidence of absence. And it is about how one person asking the right question can sometimes reopen an entire past. For years, Lisa's disappearance existed in the dark. Then Jean disappeared. The darkness grew deeper. Then Paula disappeared. And suddenly, someone turned on the light. Not enough to reveal everything. Just enough to see that something was wrong. From there, the investigation became a search. The search became evidence. The evidence became a case. And the case became a confession. But the confession is not where this story should begin. The confession belongs near the end. The beginning belongs to Lise. And to understand what happened to her, We have to understand the world around her before it changed forever. We have to enter Ottawa as it was. We have to understand the neighborhoods, the homes, the relationships, and the quiet routines that form the background of these events. We have to slow down. Because before there was a murderer, before there was a crime scene, there was a home. Before there were police questions, there was an ordinary life. And before there were 3 names on a list of victims, there were 3 women living lives that mattered. The camera now pulls away from the courtroom, away from the confession, away from the cold language of charges and sentences. It moves backward through time, past 2012, past 2010, past 2003, past the discovery, past the investigation, past the questions, until it reaches 1990. A different Ottawa, a different moment, a different life. And somewhere inside that city is Lise Roy, still alive, still part of the world, still unaware that the next chapter of her life has already begun, moving toward her. The story starts there, not with a body, not with a police officer, not with a confession, with an ordinary day. And that is precisely what makes what happened next so terrifying. Because the most frightening moment in a true crime story is not always the moment when the crime occurs. Sometimes it is the moment just before, when everything still looks normal, when nobody knows, when the future has not. An ordinary room speaks to someone she knows, closes a door, and believes there will be another morning. For Lise Roy, there would not be. But in 1990, she did not know that, and neither did anyone else. That is where we begin. Ottawa, 1990. Long before the name Camille Claireau would become associated with one of the city's darkest criminal cases, Ottawa was simply a city where people went about their lives. The mornings began quietly. Windows brightened one by one as daylight moved across residential streets. Cars appeared in driveways. Doors opened. People stepped outside carrying briefcases, grocery bags, school books, or nothing more than a cup of coffee in one hand and a set of keys in the other. The city had its own rhythm. It was not the rhythm of a place expecting violence. It was the rhythm of ordinary life. Ottawa sits along the Ottawa River, across from Gatineau, surrounded by the familiar mixture of urban streets, older neighborhoods, wooded spaces, parks, and residential communities that give the city much of its character. Government buildings and busy downtown streets existed alongside quieter neighborhoods where people could live for years without ever knowing more than the names of the because the events connected to Camille Claireau did not unfold in some isolated world removed from everyone else. They happened within an ordinary community. People bought groceries. They went to work. They visited relatives. They walked through parks. They returned home in the evening. And behind some of those doors were relationships that outsiders could not fully see. A relationship is always different from the outside. Neighbors see fragments. They might hear voices through a wall. They might notice a couple arguing. They might see one person leaving the house. They might see another person returning. But they rarely know what happens when the door closes. That private space is where much of the early history surrounding Claireau and Lise Roy existed. In 1990, Claireau was not yet a name that carried a warning. He was a man living within the community. He had a home. He had a relationship. He had neighbors. He existed inside the same routines as everyone else. And that is one of the most important things to understand before examining what happened. People who commit terrible crimes do not necessarily live in visibly terrible environments. They can live in ordinary houses. They can have ordinations about ordinary things. The human mind often searches for an explanation that matches the horror of the crime. If the crime is extreme, we expect the surroundings to be extreme as well. But the surroundings can be painfully normal. A kitchen, a living room, a bedroom, a hallway, a backyard. Nothing about those places announces what may happen inside them. In a residential neighborhood, privacy is often taken for granted. A closed door is a boundary. People generally respect it. What happens inside belongs to the people who live there. That privacy is essential to normal life, but it can also become a shield. A neighbor may hear an argument and assume it is a private disagreement. A raised voice may be followed by silence. A slammed door may be dismissed as a moment of anger. A person may appear upset one evening and perfectly calm the next morning. Without knowing the full story, outsiders have very little context. This is how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary danger. And the first known killing connected to Clairou began within that ordinary world. Lise Roy was his wife. The details available about her life, about her death. That imbalance is common in true crime. The record often preserves the crime better than it preserves the person. Police reports document evidence. Court records document charges. Investigators document timelines. But an entire human life rarely fits neatly into those documents. We know a woman existed. We know she had relationships. We know she lived somewhere. We know she was loved. Then suddenly, the record becomes much more detailed about how she disappeared. The person fades. The crime takes over. That is why setting matters. Before Lise became part of an investigation, she existed within a world of ordinary routines. The city around her was changing, as cities always do. Neighborhoods evolved. Buildings were renovated. Families moved. New roads and developments appeared. Old memories became harder to place. The passage of time would eventually become one of the greatest obstacles investigators faced. 20 years is long enough to alter a landscape. A backyard can be transformed. A property can change hands. Trees grow. Fences are replaced. People renovate. Someone who remembers in the way investigators eventually encounter it. Time does not simply move forward. It changes the physical world. And that would matter enormously when investigators later searched for evidence connected to Lise. But in 1990, none of that was visible. There was only the present. And in that present was a relationship between Lise and Clairou. Relationships are complicated even when nothing criminal is involved. Two people bring different expectations into a shared life. They carry old frustrations. They have arguments about money, family, jealousy, work, personal habits, or things too small to explain to anyone else. Most arguments end. Someone walks away. Someone apologizes. Dinner is made. The television comes on. The lights go out. Morning arrives. The argument becomes yesterday. That is what makes a violent escalation so difficult to anticipate. There is a vast distance between an ordinary argument and homicide. Most people cross neither the distance nor even the first step toward it. But according to the case, an argument between Lise and Clairou eventually became fatal. The exact emotional landscape inside that home is difficult to reconstruct completely. No transcript capturing every sentence. No outsider standing in the room to preserve the sequence of events. What remains is the evidence that surfaced much later. And that evidence tells us something devastating. The argument did not end with reconciliation. It ended with Lise dead. Then came the concealment. That part of the story changes the way we look at the setting. A home is supposed to protect the people inside it. But after the killing, the same environment became part of the concealment. The backyard was no longer simply a backyard. It became one of the locations associated with the hidden remains of Lise. And that transformation is psychologically disturbing. The landscape does not change because we know what happened. The grass still grows. Rain still falls. Leaves still collect. Sunlight still moves across the ground. But our understanding changes. A familiar place becomes haunted by information. This is one of the strange powers of crime. It can permanently change the meaning of ordinary spaces. A street corner becomes the place where someone was last seen. A house becomes the place where someone died. A park becomes the location where evidence was hidden. The physical place remains the same. Park would eventually become connected to Lisa's story in the same way. To anyone passing through, it could simply be a park. A place to walk. A place to spend time outdoors. a place that belongs to the community. But according to the case, part of Lisa's remains had been concealed there. That information would come much later. At the time, people using the park had no reason to know. They walked over the same ground. They passed beneath the same trees. They went home. The secret remained underground, and the city continued. This is one of the most important ideas in the story of Camille Claireaux. The city did not stop because someone had disappeared. There was no dramatic pause in Ottawa's history. The world did not know it was supposed to wait. People still went to work the next morning. Children still went to school. Businesses opened. Traffic moved. Snow came. Snow melted. Summer arrived. The seasons carried everyone forward, except the people who were left behind by Lisa's disappearance. For them, time behaved differently. A missing person creates a strange relationship with the calendar. Every date becomes a reminder. Birthdays, anniversaries, holidays. Date that once meant celebration can become painful. The longer someone remains missing, the more difficult it can become to know how to grieve. There is no certainty, only absence. And absence can be interpreted in many ways. Maybe she left. Maybe she wanted to start again. Maybe she was angry. Maybe she did not want to be contacted. Maybe she was somewhere else. Maybe she was alive. The possibilities can multiply endlessly. But there is another side to the disappearance. The person who knows the truth does not live inside uncertainty. They know. That imbalance is difficult to comprehend. One side waits. The other side knows there is nothing to wait for. And according to the case, Claireaux was the person who knew. He knew what had happened to Lise. He knew where evidence had been concealed. And yet the outside world did not have the same knowledge. That difference would persist for years. Then, 13 years after Lisa's disappearance, another chapter began. By 2003, the world had changed. Technology had changed. Communications had changed. The city had changed. But one thing remained the same. Camille Claireaux was still Jean Rock. Jean was his partner. Her relationship with him was different from Lisa's. The circumstances surrounding her disappearance were also different. But the result was tragically familiar. Jean disappeared. And once again, the people around her were left with questions. But this time there was something else. A story designed to explain the disappearance. Letters. Messages that suggested Jean was still alive. A person can be present in someone's life without physically being present. A photograph can make someone feel close. A telephone call can create connection. A letter can do the same. Words written on paper can cross a distance and create the illusion of presence. For Jean's family, those letters could have seemed like proof that she had made a decision to leave. That interpretation would have been painful, but it would have been very different from believing she had been murdered. The human mind often chooses the explanation it can survive. If the alternative is that someone you love has been killed, almost any other possibility can feel easier to accept. Maybe she left. Maybe she needed a new life. Maybe she wanted distance. At least then she was alive. That possibility. And if someone deliberately manufactures it, they are not simply hiding a crime. They are shaping another person's emotional reality. That makes the story of Jean's disappearance particularly disturbing. The deception could continue only as long as the story remained believable. And for years it did. Until Claireaux was arrested in connection with Paula Leclerc. Then the past began to surface. Paula's case had one feature that made it especially dangerous for him. A visible benefit. The apartment. Claireaux wanted it. And after Paula disappeared, he began using it. This was no longer simply a question of where a missing woman had gone. There was now a question of possession. Why was he moving into her space? Why was he acting as though she had voluntarily surrendered it? Why did the circumstances seem wrong to her son? Why did the story not fit the reality people could see? These questions brought investigators closer. And when investigators looked closer, they found the past This is how the setting of a crime can become the mechanism of its discovery. The apartment was not isolated. It was surrounded by other people. Neighbors could observe changes. Family could, but it also has witnesses. People see who comes and goes. They remember. They may not understand the importance of what they see at the time, but memory can become evidence later. A person might remember seeing someone carrying boxes. Someone else might remember a conversation. Someone might remember that a woman had not been seen for days. Individually, each detail may appear insignificant. Together, they can form a picture, and investigators are trained to assemble pictures from fragments. By 2010, Clarua's world was becoming smaller. The story he had constructed around Paula could not withstand scrutiny, and when police began examining him, they found themselves looking backward, back to Jean, back to Lise, back to years that had seemed disconnected. The setting was no longer just Ottawa in 2010. It was Ottawa across 20 years. That is a very different landscape. Investigators had to navigate not only physical locations but time itself. What had existed in 1990? Where had Lise lived? Who knew her? What did people remember? What had changed? What remained? The further investigators traveled backward, past had left traces. The places were still there. Some people still remembered. And most importantly, Claru himself eventually provided information that helped connect the disappearances. The man who had been at the center of all three stories could no longer remain outside the investigation. The setting had changed. The city had changed. But the central figure had remained. And the three women were now connected by a single timeline. Lise, Jean, Paula. The first two disappearances had survived in uncertainty. The third created a visible contradiction, and that contradiction opened the door. The next stage would be to understand the women themselves, because a location can tell us where something happened. A timeline can tell us when. Evidence can tell us what happened, but none of those things can tell us who the victims were. For that, we have to look beyond the crime. We have to step inside their ordinary lives. We have to imagine the people they spoke to, the routines they followed, the relationships they built, the small things that made them recognizable to the people who loved them. Because a victim is not simply the final event in their life. The final event is only the part we know most about. First, Jean came first. Paula came first. And before their names became connected to a criminal investigation, they were simply women living in Ottawa. That is the setting in which this tragedy unfolded. A city that looked ordinary. A neighborhood that looked ordinary. A relationship that looked private. An apartment that looked like someone's home. A park that looked like a park. A backyard that looked like a backyard. Nothing announced the horror beneath the surface. Nothing warned the people passing by. And that is perhaps the most unsettling image with which to leave this chapter. A city going about its day. A man carrying his own secrets. A woman living her life without knowing what was coming. And beneath the ordinary landscape, a future crime, waiting to become a mystery. For years, the city would keep moving, but the truth would remain, buried, hidden, waiting, until someone finally began to look. There is another reason the setting matters. It is not only because of where the crimes happened, it is because of how normal those places were. When people hear the words serial killer, the imagination often creates a particular landscape. An isolated house, stretch of forest, a place where nobody would hear anything. But Camille Clarua's story does not fit neatly into that picture. The women connected to him lived within an ordinary world. The places around them were not designed for secrecy. They were places where people lived close to one another, yet could remain strangers. That contradiction is one of the defining features of modern cities. You can live beside someone for years and know almost nothing about what happens behind their front door. You can recognize a face without knowing a name. You can know someone's car without knowing where they go. You can hear a voice through a wall without knowing what the conversation is about. And you can see a relationship from the outside without understanding what it feels like from within. That distance between appearance and reality would become important in the story of Lise Roy. She was married to Clairou. A marriage, from the outside, carries an assumption of familiarity. If two people share a home, people naturally imagine that they know one another deeply. They eat together. They sleep under the same roof. They share bills, routines, frustrations, plans. They become part of the same social circle. But intimacy does not guarantee transparency. Sometimes knows how to hide things from you. A stranger may be easier to distrust. Someone close to you has already been granted access. That access can take many forms. Access to a home. Access to personal information. Access to routines. Access to trust. Access to the private spaces where other people rarely look. This is one of the reasons domestic violence and domestic homicide can be so difficult to detect before the final act. The relationship itself creates an explanation for behavior that might otherwise seem suspicious. Why is he angry? They are having problems. Why did they argue? Couples argue. Why is she upset? They have been under stress. Why did she leave? Maybe they separated. Every explanation may sound ordinary. And because ordinary explanations are common, they can hide extraordinary situations. The case of Lise Roy began inside that environment. The information available about her personal life is limited. That limitation is important to acknowledge. There are cases in which the public record preserves thousands of details about a victim. Photographs, interviews, friends' memories, letters, histories. In other cases, the record becomes painfully thin. The victim's identity is reduced to a few lines. Name, age, relationship, date, cause of death. And then the suspect takes over the narrative. That is something a responsible telling of the story has to resist. The lack of surviving public detail about Lise does not mean her life was small. It only means that history did not preserve all of it for us. Somewhere, there were people who knew her differently from the way a court file could describe her. Someone knew her laugh. Someone knew what irritated her. Someone knew the way she spoke when she was tired. Someone knew the things she liked. Someone knew what she was like when she was happy. Those details may never appear in an investigation, but they existed. And they mattered. The same is true of Jean Rock. When Jean became connected to Clairou, she entered a different chapter of his life. By 2003, the world around them was not the same world Lise had known in 1990. 13 years had passed. The technology people used to communicate had changed. The city had evolved. The people around them had grown older, had ended. New relationships had formed. The physical environment itself had changed. But one man remained a constant across the timeline. That continuity is what makes the case so disturbing when viewed from a distance. Imagine seeing the 3 years written on a sheet of paper. 1990, 1991, 1992. At first, the dates look disconnected. There is a gap between the first and second. Another gap between the second and third. There is no obvious straight line. But criminal investigations rarely begin with a straight line. They begin with fragments. One fragment might be a missing person report. Another might be a statement from a family member. Another might be an old address. Another might be a suspicious document. Another might be a confession. The investigator's task is to determine whether those fragments belong to the same picture. And with Clairou, they eventually did. But that picture would have been much harder to see without the third disappearance. Paula Leclerc was older than the other women associated with the case. She was 64. She was not his wife. She was not his romantic partner. She was his neighbor. That made the relationship a strange position in our lives. Close enough to observe, far enough to remain separate. You may know when the neighbor receives mail. You may know what their car looks like. You may occasionally speak in the hallway. You may borrow something. You may complain about noise. You may exchange polite greetings. But you usually do not know their deepest personal problems. That limited familiarity can create a sense of safety. A neighbor is familiar. Familiarity can become trust, and trust can become access. According to the case, Clairou wanted Paula's apartment. The reason was connected to the apartment itself, its location, its view. Something about the physical space made it desirable to him. That detail is important because it gives the third case a different shape from the first two. With Lise, the killing emerged from an argument within a marriage. With Jean, the disappearance was followed by an attempt to create the appearance that she had voluntarily left. With Paula, there was something tangible at stake. Property. Space. Possession. A home. And a home is more than four walls. For the person living there, it contains evidence of an entire living. Furniture. Mail. Personal objects. Things that have no monetary value to anyone else, but are deeply meaningful to the owner. When Paula disappeared, those objects did not disappear with her. They remained. And because they remained, the apartment itself became a silent witness. Clairou's behavior after her disappearance became difficult to separate from what had happened to her. He moved his belongings into the apartment. That act transformed the space. Imagine a room that once belonged entirely to Paula. Her furniture. Her possessions. Her routines. Her sense of privacy. Then imagine another man's belongings appearing inside it. A stranger's things occupying the space of someone who has suddenly vanished. To an outsider, the objects might appear ordinary. A bag. A piece of furniture. Personal belongings. But context changes meaning. A suitcase inside an apartment is normal. A suitcase inside the apartment of a woman who has disappeared is different. A new occupant is normal when a tenant moves out. A new occupant is suspicious when the previous tenant has vanished under notice something was wrong. He knew the space differently. He knew his mother. He knew what belonged to her, and he knew what did not. This is often overlooked when people discuss investigations. Detectives do not always discover the truth because they're standing at the perfect place at the perfect time. Sometimes they discover it because a family member knows the victim well enough to notice an inconsistency. A missing person's life contains thousands of small details. A detective may know the case. A family knows the person. That distinction can be crucial. Paula's son saw a story that did not make sense, and once the story was questioned, the police had reason to look closer. The investigation that followed would eventually reach backward through Clairou's history. That backward movement is where the setting becomes almost like a map. Every place connected to the case carries a different layer of time. Paula's apartment represents 2010. Jean's disappearance takes investigators back to 2003. Lisa's story takes them all the way to 1990. 20 years of history. 20 years of ordinary life, continuing around extraordinary secrets. A map of Ottawa can be read in many ways. Roads, things, distances. But an investigator reads a map differently. A location becomes a question. Why here? Why this property? Why this apartment? Why this park? Why this particular place? And when a person is missing, geography can become a form of evidence. Where was she last seen? Where did she live? Where did the suspect live? What route could someone have taken? What places did they have access to? What locations were familiar? What locations were isolated enough to conceal something? The answers do not automatically solve a crime, but they can narrow the possibilities. And in a case that has remained hidden for years, narrowing possibilities is everything. By the time investigators began examining Clairou's past, the physical landscape had already changed. That created another challenge. The longer a crime remains unsolved, the more the world changes around the evidence. A tree grows. A fence is replaced. A building is renovated. A property changes owners. A road is repaved. A park is maintained. The natural environment does not preserve a crime scene for investigators. Lisa's remains was so significant. The locations connected to her had survived long enough for investigators to search them. Something remained despite the passage of time. The ground had not forgotten, and neither had the investigation, once the right questions were asked. There is a psychological dimension to this, as well. People tend to believe that time makes secrets safer. In some ways, it does. Memories fade. Witnesses move. People die. Documents disappear. Physical environments change. But time can also create contradictions. A story told once may sound convincing. A story repeated years later may contain details that no longer match. People forget what they originally said. They confuse dates. They remember events differently, and investigators can compare those differences. A long-hidden crime, therefore, becomes a strange battle between forgetting and remembering. The offender hopes time will erase. Investigators hope time has preserved enough. The families hope time will eventually bring answers. And the victims cannot speak at all. That final silence makes the physical evidence even more important, because when a victim cannot tell investigators what happened, location becomes their witness. The objects become their witness. The people who remember them become their witness. And sometimes, the person responsible becomes the witness against himself. That would eventually happen with Clairou. But before that point, there was still a long road between suspicion and certainty. The police needed to understand the man at the center of the case. They needed to understand his relationships. They needed to understand the circumstances around each woman. And they needed to determine whether the 3 disappearances represented coincidence or something far more deliberate. The answer would become clear, but the path to that answer would force investigators to look at a man who had managed to exist in ordinary society while carrying extraordinary secrets. That is not an easy psychological contradiction to process. We tend to separate people into categories: good people, bad people, safe people, dangerous people. But real human behavior is rarely so visually obvious. A person can be polite in one situation and cruel in another. They can appear calm while concealing something terrible. They can behave normally because normal behavior is part of the disguise. Dangerous. Quite the opposite. Most people are not. But it does mean that appearances alone cannot explain violent behavior. Clairou's case demonstrates how little the surface of a life can reveal. For years, the outside world saw pieces of a normal existence. Relationships, homes, neighbors, daily routines. Nothing about those things automatically signals homicide, and that is precisely why the story remained hidden. The danger was not standing outside the community. It was inside it. Not necessarily in a dramatic way, not with warning signs that everyone could recognize. It was embedded within relationships and circumstances that appeared ordinary until viewed through the lens of what eventually happened. That lens changes everything. The same apartment looks different once you know why it mattered. The same park looks different once you know what was hidden there. The same backyard looks different once investigators uncover what had been buried. The same letters look different once you know they were part of a deception. The same man looks different once his history is known. This is the strange power of hindsight. It can make the past seem obvious, but it was not obvious to the people living through it. Judge every person who failed to see the pattern as though they had access to information that only became available years later. They did not have the full picture. They had fragments. The families had fragments. The neighbors had fragments. The police had fragments. Clairou had the whole story. At least he believed he did. He believed that the past could remain divided. Lise in one part of his life, Jean in another, Paula somewhere else. Different years, different explanations, different circumstances. But investigations have a way of collapsing those divisions. Once the names were placed together, the timeline became visible. Once the locations were compared, The geography became meaningful. Once the statements were examined, the stories began to overlap. And once the physical evidence was found, the past could no longer be dismissed as speculation. The city itself had become part of the evidence. Ottawa had not known what it was carrying, but the city had carried the story all along, under its streets, inside its buildings, among its neighborhoods, in the memories of its residents, and within the history of one man. That is where the setting of this case becomes a silent character. It does not speak. It does not remember in the human sense, but it preserves. It preserves locations. It preserves distances. It preserves buildings. It preserves the shape of places where people once lived. And when investigators return years later, those places can help reconstruct what happened. The city does not explain the crime, but it can show investigators where to look. And sometimes that is enough. By 2010, the setting had changed dramatically from the world of 1990. But one thing remained constant. Clairou was still moving through it. The same basic human world surrounded him. People trusted. People assumed. People looked forward. People went home. People believed that the missing person might still be somewhere. That belief could last only until the evidence became impossible to ignore. When Paula's disappearance forced that moment, the old world began to collapse. The apartment was no longer simply a desirable space. It was part of a homicide investigation. The missing woman was no longer simply absent. She was a victim. And the man who had tried to make her disappearance look voluntary was now. Then the investigators began asking about the women who had come before. That question is where the setting finally gives way to the people. Because the streets and buildings can tell us where the story happened. The dates can tell us when. But the women can tell us why the story matters. Lise Roy, Jean Rock, Paula Leclerc. Their lives existed separately before the investigation connected them. They did not know they would become part of the same case. They could not have known that their names would one day appear together. And they certainly could not have known that the disappearance of one woman would eventually help explain the disappearance of another. That is the cruel architecture of this case. The women were separated by time. The investigation brought them together. The city connected the locations, and the truth connected the lives. Before we move deeper into what happened, there is one final image worth holding on to. Picture Ottawa at night. Windows glowing across apartment buildings. A few cars moving along the streets. A pedestrian walking home. A light switching off in one room, another turning on somewhere else. Behind each window, a private life. Arguments. Laughter. Phone calls. Plans for tomorrow. The city looks peaceful from a distance. It always does. But peace on the outside tells us very little about what happens behind closed doors. Somewhere in that ordinary city, a woman was living the final period of her life. Without knowing it. Somewhere else, another woman would eventually disappear. Years later, another would vanish. And for a long time, nobody would understand that these events belonged to the same story. The city would continue sleeping. Morning would come. People would go to work. The seasons would change. And beneath all of it, the truth would wait. Not because the truth had disappeared, because no one had yet learned where to look. Then someone did. And once they did, everything changed. The setting was no longer just Ottawa. It was a map of unanswered questions. A home. An apartment. A park. A backyard. 3 women. 1 man. 20 years. And beneath the ordinary surface of all of it, a story that had been waiting for someone to put the pieces together. Now, for the first time, we step away from the streets and the buildings. We step away from, and we turn toward the people whose lives gave this story its meaning. Because before Lise Roy was missing, she was alive. Before Jean Rock was a name in an investigation, she was living her own life. Before Paula Leclerc's apartment became evidence, it was simply her home. The next chapter begins with those lives. And that is where the real story should begin. There is a moment in every investigation when a place stops being merely a place. A house becomes an address in a case file. An apartment becomes a crime scene. A park becomes a search location. A backyard becomes a piece of evidence. The transformation does not happen because the buildings change. It happens because knowledge changes. Before the investigation, a person sees a backyard and thinks about grass, fences, weather, maintenance, perhaps a garden. After the investigation, that same person may look at the ground and wonder what happened there. Before the investigation, an apartment is simply someone's home. Afterward, every object inside it can carry a question. Who placed it there? When was it moved? Why was it moved? Who benefited from the change? The physical world remains almost exactly where it was. But the meaning is one of the reasons the Camille Claire case is so unsettling. The places associated with the women were not distant from ordinary life. They were part of it. The crime did not happen in a world separated from society. It happened within society. And for years, the people around those places continued living without knowing what had occurred. That is difficult to imagine. A neighbor can walk past a house every morning without knowing that something terrible happened there. A person can spend an afternoon in a park without knowing that investigators will one day search that same ground. Someone can enter an apartment and see nothing unusual, because the most important fact about that apartment is invisible. The absence of knowledge creates its own kind of normality, and normality can be remarkably convincing. That is what allowed the years to pass. 1990 became 1991, then 1992, then the middle of the decade, then 2000. The calendar kept moving. For the outside world, the disappearance of Lise Roy became part of the past. But the past is not always finished simply because people stop talking about it. Sometimes it remains active beneath the surface. A family remembers. A name remains in old records. Else has. A location continues holding physical evidence. And a secret can remain alive for as long as the person protecting it remains silent. That is what makes a long unsolved case different from a crime that is solved quickly. When police arrive within hours or days, the world is still close to the moment of violence. Fresh memories, fresh evidence, fresh emotions, fresh traces. But when 20 years pass, the investigation becomes an excavation of time. The investigators are no longer looking only for what happened. They are looking for what survived. What survived the weather? What survived renovations? What survived changes in relationships? What survived the fading of memory? What survived the death or disappearance of witnesses? And what survived inside the mind of the person who knew the truth? For Lise Roy, the answer was hidden in several places. Her remains had been concealed in different locations. One was associated with the old property. Another was Hetherington Park. The significance of those places would not be understood immediately. At first, they were simply part of the landscape. The park remained a park. The property remained a property. Beneath them contained evidence of a crime. That is one of the most disturbing things about buried evidence. It does not announce itself. There is no visible boundary around it. No sign. No warning. The surface can look completely undisturbed. A person can stand a few feet away and never know. That silence can last for years, sometimes decades. And then investigators arrive. They change the atmosphere immediately. The ordinary relationship people have with a place disappears. The location is measured, examined, searched. Every detail becomes potentially meaningful. The people conducting the search are no longer looking at the landscape as residents would. They're looking at it as investigators. A patch of ground is no longer just a patch of ground. A disturbed area is not merely a landscaping issue. An object is not simply an object. Everything has to be considered within the timeline. This is the slow work of reconstructing a hidden crime. It requires patience. It requires restraint. And most of all, it requires accepting that the evidence may not look dramatic. Television often compresses forensic work into a few seconds. Everyone immediately knows what it means. Real investigations are rarely that simple. Evidence can be incomplete. Information can conflict. Searches can produce nothing. A location can be examined and left behind. Then another lead appears. The process moves forward, then backward, then sideways. And in an old case, the investigators are constantly fighting the passage of time. The setting itself becomes an opponent. Nature covers. People renovate. Buildings change. Memories weaken. Yet the case against Clairou eventually became strong enough to connect 3 deaths. That did not happen because one piece of evidence magically explained everything. It happened because different pieces began supporting one another. The apartment, the disappearance, the statements, the earlier women, the locations, the remains, and eventually, Clairou's own admissions. But to understand how significant that was, it is worth stepping back again. Imagine Ottawa in 1990. There is no knowledge of the future. No one knows that a disappearance will eventually be linked to 2 other women. No one knows murders. No one knows that investigators will return years later. People experience only the present. That is how every crime begins. The future is invisible. The people involved cannot see the pattern that historians and investigators will later construct. This is why hindsight can be dangerous. It creates the illusion that everything should have been obvious. It rarely was. We know now that Lise was killed. We know now that Jean was killed. We know now that Paula was killed. We know now that Clairou would eventually admit responsibility. But the people living through those years did not have that knowledge. For them, Lise was missing. Jean was missing. Paula was missing. Those are not the same thing as knowing someone has been murdered. A missing person exists in a terrible space between presence and absence. There is no certainty, and uncertainty changes the way people behave. Families may search. They may contact friends. They may examine old conversations. They may wonder whether they missed a warning. They may imagine the person somewhere else. They may hold on to the possibility of return. They may even defend the missing person against people who suggest something darker. Because exceptionality is painful, the false letters connected to Jean's disappearance demonstrate how powerful that uncertainty can be. If the family believes Jean has left voluntarily, they may wait. They may hope. They may search differently. They may think about her decisions instead of her safety. A manufactured explanation can therefore influence not only emotions but behavior. It can determine what people do next. And as long as the explanation appears plausible, the investigation may not move in the direction it needs to move. That is why Paula's disappearance became such an important turning point. Her son did not simply accept the explanation. He saw something wrong. And once the police became involved, the story changed. The investigation moved from absence to suspicion, from suspicion to evidence, from one woman to another. The past began opening. The man who had spent years moving through different chapters of his life suddenly found those chapters being placed side by side. That is a dangerous moment for anyone trying to keep separate secrets, because separate stories become harder to maintain when they are compared. A statement about one woman can be compared with a statement about another. A timeline can be compared with another behavior. And patterns emerge. Investigators do not need to prove that 2 events are identical. They need to understand whether they are connected. In Clairou's case, the connection was not simply geographic. It was personal. Lise was his wife. Jean was his partner. Paula was his neighbor. Different forms of access. Different forms of trust. Different circumstances. But one common denominator. Clairou. That is where the psychological landscape of the case begins to matter. Control can operate differently depending on the relationship. With a spouse, control may exist inside domestic routines. With a partner, it may exist inside emotional dependence. With a neighbor, it may involve proximity and access. The specific circumstances change. The underlying dynamic can remain. The case record does not allow every psychological detail to be known with certainty. That distinction matters. We should not invent motives where the evidence does not establish them. We can describe what happened. We can examine what Claru did. We can consider the apparent motives identified in the case. But we cannot enter his mind and claim to know every thought he had. It gives us patterns. Patterns allow careful analysis. But there must always be a line between analysis and invention. That line is especially important in true crime. The victims deserve accuracy. The families deserve accuracy. And even when the facts are disturbing, the story does not become stronger by adding things that cannot be established. The truth is already enough. In this case, the truth is that 3 women died. The truth is that their deaths remained hidden for years. The truth is that one disappearance eventually exposed another. The truth is that Claru pleaded guilty. And the truth is that the physical world around Ottawa carried pieces of that history long before the public understood it. That is the setting. Not simply Ottawa as a geographical location, but Ottawa as a place of ordinary routines surrounding extraordinary secrets. A city where people lived close together without necessarily knowing one another deeply. A city with houses and apartments, parks and roads, private spaces and public spaces. A city that changed over 20 years while one hidden story remained remarkably persistent. The weather changed too. Winter covered the city in snow. Spring brought on beneath the heat. Autumn scattered leaves across parks and yards. Nature did what nature always does. It covered the surface. But beneath that surface, the past remained. That image is difficult to escape. Snow falls over a place where evidence may be hidden. Then spring arrives. The snow melts. Grass grows. People return to the park. No one knows. Another year passes. Then another. The secret becomes older, but not necessarily weaker. In fact, the longer it remains undiscovered, the more astonishing it becomes when it is finally found. The passage of time can make a crime feel almost unreal. 20 years. How can something so important remain hidden for 20 years? The answer is that human beings are capable of living with incomplete information. They fill gaps with explanations. They accept what seems plausible. They move forward. That is not necessarily carelessness. It is how everyday life works. We cannot investigate every inconsistency in every person's life. We have to trust. We have to assume. We have to accept that most ordinary situations are exploited, that ordinary assumption, at least for a time. But no deception lasts forever. There is always the possibility that someone will ask a question. There is always the possibility that a relative will notice something. There is always the possibility that an investigator will compare old information with new evidence. And there is always the possibility that the physical world will preserve what people tried to erase. That is what happened here. The story of Paula LeClaire opened the door. Behind it was Jean Rock. Behind Jean was Lise Roy. And behind the names were places that had been waiting silently for years. By 2012, the case had reached court. The setting had changed again. The streets outside the courthouse were part of a modern city. The women were gone. The suspect was no longer simply a neighbor, husband, or partner. He was an accused murderer. And the courtroom transformed the private history of 3 women into a public legal record. Claru pleaded guilty. There would be no need for a jury to decide whether he had committed the 3 killings. The legal system recorded his responsibility. Life imprisonment followed. But even then, the setting remained important, because justice inside a community. The sentence is read. The judge speaks. The accused hears the consequences. The families hear the truth. And outside, the city continues. Cars still move through Ottawa. People still walk the streets. New residents may have no idea what happened decades earlier. The The city absorbs the story into its history, but the families cannot absorb it so easily. For them, the places remain personal. A street may remind them of someone. A home may remind them of a life that ended. A park may carry a memory that nobody else shares. This is why place matters so much in grief. People do not remember only faces. They remember rooms. They remember streets. They remember where someone used to sit. They remember the places where they last spoke. They remember where they expected to see someone again. A missing person can leave behind a geography of memory. And when the truth finally emerges, that geography changes. The places that once represented uncertainty can become places associated with certainty. But certainty is not always comforting. Sometimes knowing what happened is simply the beginning of learning how to live with it. That is the burden left behind after an old investigation. The court can issue the sentence. The public can move on. But families continue. Their lives have to absorb what happened. Their memories have to make room for the truth. And the victims have to be remembered as people, not simply as the women whose deaths exposed a killer. That is where our attention now needs to go. Away from the architecture of the city. Away from the map. Away from the man who stood at the center. Toward the women. Because the setting can explain where the tragedy unfolded. It cannot explain the value of the lives that were lost. For that, we have to meet them. We have to slow down enough to understand that each woman occupied a different world before her name became connected to this case. Lise Roy had her own history. Jean Rock had her own relationships and identity. Paula LeClaire had her own home and life. The investigation eventually placed them together. Their lives did not begin together, and their stories should not be remembered only because they ended together. So before the next chapter begins, hold on to the image of the city. Not the city as a crime map. The city as a living place. A place where mornings came and went. Where people opened curtains filled with ordinary movement. Where apartments contained private lives. Where backyards looked like backyards. And where the passage of time could make almost anything seem distant. Somewhere inside that world, 3 women lived. One would disappear in 1990. Another in 2003. Another in 2010. For years, nobody understood that the 3 stories belonged together. Then the pattern emerged. And once it emerged, it could not be unseen. The city had been ordinary. The crime was not. The landscape had been familiar. The truth beneath it was hidden. And the silence had lasted long enough. Now we leave the setting behind. We leave the streets and parks. We leave the apartment that became a turning point. We leave the backyard where the past was eventually uncovered. And we turn toward the women themselves. Because the next question is no longer where they lived. It is who they were. Who was Lise Roy before the disappearance? Who was Jean Rock before the letters? Who was Paula LeClaire before her apartment became the center of a police investigation? Those are the questions that deserve the next chapter. Because in the end, the most important thing a true crime story can recover. It is memory. It is the recognition that the people we call victims had lives before anyone called them victims. And those lives began long before Camille Claireau entered the story. The investigation would eventually tell us how the women died. But before we reach that point, we need to remember how they lived. That is where their story truly begins.